Welcome back to Payback Logs. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. The first thing I realized when I woke up was that the world had moved on without me. A coma isn't like sleep. It's a theft. You close your eyes in one reality and open them in another, lacking the context of the days, weeks, or, in my case, 3 months that have vanished. The hospital room was a symphony of beige and antiseptic white, the air heavy with the rhythmic mechanical sigh of a ventilator I no longer needed. My name is Arthur. I'm 75 years old, and until my stroke, I was the man the wealthiest families in the state called when they wanted their assets to become invisible. I was the architect of the paper fortress. I spent 40 years as a title and trust attorney. I didn't just write wills. I built labyrinths. I made sure that private property stayed private, protected by layers of shell companies, land trusts, and ironclad reversionary clauses. I lived by a simple rule. If you can't find the owner, you can't take the land. I was still struggling to reconnect my mind to my muscles when the door to my rehab suite swung open. My daughter-in-law, Sloane, walked in. She didn't look like a woman visiting a recovering relative. She looked like a woman who had just closed the deal of her lifetime. She was wearing a Chanel power suit and a smile that felt as synthetic as the hospital floor. "Arthur, you're finally awake. The doctor said it was a miracle," she chirped, setting a glossy high-end brochure on my bedside table. I couldn't speak well yet. My tongue felt like a piece of dry leather, but I managed a raspy "home. I want to go home." The smile on Sloane's face didn't falter, but her eyes went cold. She sat on the edge of my bed and patted my hand with a gloved hand. "Oh, Arthur, we need to be realistic. The Rosewood estate, it was just too much. Without Rose there to manage the gardens, and with your condition, it was becoming a liability, a money pit. The taxes alone were staggering." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet room. Rosewood wasn't just a house. It was a 1920s coastal masterpiece, 5 acres of prime shoreline that my late wife Rose had spent 30 years turning into a sanctuary. It was the physical manifestation of our life together. "What did you do?" I forced the words out. She leaned in, her voice dropping into a tone of practiced pity. "Oh, Arthur, I did what you would have wanted, Arthur. I utilized the general power of attorney you signed before the stroke to liquidate the liability. I sold Rosewood to Azure Development Group. They're going to build luxury condos. It's a beautiful project. And the proceeds? Well, they're paying for this lovely facility. You'll have 24-hour care, social mixers, and a view of the park. It's much more age-appropriate for you." "Sold?" The word felt like a physical blow. "You can't. The trust—" "Arthur, dear," she interrupted, her voice hardening, "you're confused. The trauma of the stroke has made your memory a bit foggy. You were very clear before you got sick. You said you wanted to simplify. You signed everything over to the family trust I manage. Rosewood is gone. The bulldozers are already scheduled for next month." She stood up, smoothing her skirt. "Rest now. Don't stress your brain with legalities. I've handled everything. You're safe here." She walked out, leaving the brochure behind. The Gables, assisted living for the discerning senior. I stared at the ceiling. She thought I was a broken man. She thought the stroke had erased 40 years of legal mastery. She assumed that because she had a piece of paper labeled power of attorney, she had the keys to the kingdom. But she made a fatal mistake. She forgot who I was. In my world, a general power of attorney is a powerful tool, but it's a blunt instrument. It can't bypass a specialized irrevocable land trust with a consent of the managed member clause. Sloane thought she had sold the estate, but in the world of title law, you can't sell what you don't legally hold. I looked at the bedside table. My hands were shaking, but they were starting to remember how to move. I didn't reach for the brochure. I reached for the call button. I didn't need a nurse. I needed a phone, and I needed to see exactly how many total defects in title Sloane had created while she was busy spending my money.
The paper fortress was still standing. Sloane had just walked into the moat, and she didn't realize the tide was coming in.
The following week was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Every time I tried to raise the issue of the deed or the specifics of the trust, Sloane was ready with a new layer of concern. She brought in a private consultant, a man who looked more like a debt collector in a tailored suit than a medical professional, to evaluate my cognitive progress. "Arthur," Sloane said, sitting by my window while the consultant hovered in the corner with a tablet, "we talked about this yesterday, don't you remember? You were so relieved when I told you the closing went through. You cried tears of joy because you wouldn't have to worry about the roof leaks at Rosewood anymore." "I did not," I rasped. My voice was getting stronger, but I kept it low, playing into her narrative of the frail, fading patriarch. "See," she said, turning to the consultant, "the confabulation is getting worse. He's creating a reality where he's still the big-shot lawyer. It's a defense mechanism. He can't handle the fact that he's the one who authorized the sale." She leaned over me, her perfume cloying and suffocating. "You were so tired, Arthur. You told me, 'Sloane, I can't breathe in that big house without Rose. Just sell it. Give me a small room with a view and some peace.' I have the recordings on my phone, dear. Do you want to hear yourself, or would that be too painful?" She didn't have recordings. She had an ego that assumed I was too damaged to call her bluff. She was trying to rewrite my own history, painting me as a man who had surrendered his legacy out of grief and exhaustion. "The power of attorney," I said, looking her in the eye. "It was limited." "No, Arthur, it was general, all-encompassing," she snapped, the mask of the doving daughter-in-law slipping for just a fraction of a second. "I have the notarized original. I used it to dissolve the Arthur and Rose trust because, as your agent, I determined it was no longer in your best interest. The developer has already paid the first $5 million into the family account, the one I control for your protection." She was trying to convince me that the very laws I had used to protect others had somehow betrayed me. She was using medical necessity as a cloak for what was in reality a high-stakes heist. "You're safe now, Arthur," she whispered, her hand squeezing mine a little too hard. "No more law, no more deeds, just rest." When she left, she took my official tablet, the one the facility provided, claiming she needed to update the security settings. She wanted me isolated. She wanted me to doubt my own mind until I became the hollow shell she needed me to be. But Sloane isn't a lawyer. She's a socialite who thinks the law is just a collection of suggestions. She didn't realize that while I was confabulating, I was actually performing a mental audit. I had spent 40 years memorizing the Uniform Trust Code. I knew something she didn't. An irrevocable land trust cannot be dissolved by a general POA unless the trust document explicitly grants that power to an agent, which mine most certainly did not. In fact, I had specifically included an anti-delegation clause to prevent exactly this scenario. She wasn't just gaslighting me, she was committing a constructive fraud. She thought she was erasing my past. She didn't realize she was just giving me a checklist of crimes to charge her with once I got back on my feet. I waited until the night shift took over. The nurse, a young man named Kevin, who had a soft spot for the old counselor, came in to check my vitals. "Kevin," I whispered, "I need a favor. I need a burner phone, and I need a copy of the County Gazette." The game was no longer about recovery. It was about reversion. The hum of the rehab facility faded as I stared at the flickering screen of the burner phone Kevin had secured for me. In the dark, the blue light felt like a portal back to the life Sloane thought she had buried. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I wasn't a patient in a sterile room. I was back in the wood-paneled war room of my firm, Vance, Sterling and Associates. I spent 40 years as the state's top title and trust attorney. I was the man who specialized in the unbreakable. While other lawyers were writing simple wills, I was crafting multi-tiered asset protection vehicles. I understood that the greatest threat to a legacy isn't the taxman or the market, it's the intra-family vulture. I remembered the day Rose and I sat down to finalize the Rosewood Land Trust. Rose was a landscape architect. She saw the land as a living thing. I saw it as a legal fortress. "Arthur," she had said, her hand resting on the heavy vellum of the deed, "I don't want this place to ever become a bargaining chip. I want the birds to have the trees and the house to have the salt air long after we're gone." So I built the Rosewood Irrevocable Land Trust. It wasn't just a standard trust, it was an asset protection trust, APT, tied to a shell entity in a jurisdiction with no reciprocity for general powers of attorney. I designed it with a consent of the managed member clause. To sell, encumber, or dissolve the trust, the managing member, me, had to provide a physically notarized certificate of consent. I remembered the ghost of my most famous case, the Beaumont inheritance. A grandson had tried to use a forged power of attorney to sell his grandfather's ranch to a casino group. I was the one who found the fatal flaw, the fact that the property was held in a spendthrift trust that didn't recognize the grandson's authority. I watched that young man's face turn white as the judge voided the $20 million sale in under 10 minutes. Sloane was playing the Beaumont game, but she was playing it against the man who wrote the playbook. She assumed that because I was the grantor, I was also the legal owner. In her mind, POA plus owner equals sale. But in my world, ownership is a mirage. The Rosewood estate wasn't owned by Arthur Vance. It was owned by RV Coastal Holdings, LLC, which was owned by the Rosewood Trust, of which I was merely the beneficiary and managing member. As a gesture, I had given Sloane general power of attorney, but that power was as empty as the hologram of a penny on the front of her company brochure. Sloane had essentially tried to sell a car she didn't have the title for, using a permission slip signed by a man who technically didn't own the car in his personal capacity. I looked at the photo of Rose I kept by my bed. She was standing under the great oak at Rosewood, the sun catching the silver in her hair. "She's a ghost in her own house, Rose," I whispered. "She thinks she's the queen of the manor because she has a brochure and a fancy suit, but she forgot to check the chain of title." I opened the browser on the burner phone and navigated to the county clerk's online portal. My heart was steady now. The ghost of the past wasn't a haunting, it was a reinforcement. I was going to find the specific documents Sloane had filed. I was going to find the lies she told the county recorder. And then I was going to use 40 years of legal haunting to turn her closing day into a living nightmare. Midnight in the rehab facility has a specific sound. The squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum and the distant, rhythmic beep of monitors. Under the glow of my thin hospital blanket, the burner phone felt like a live wire. I navigated to the County Recorder of Deeds digital portal. My fingers, still stiff from the stroke, fumbled over the keys, but my mind was a laser. I searched for Rosewood Estate and RV Coastal Holdings, LLC. There it was. Filed 30 days ago, a statutory warranty deed. I zoomed in on the scanned PDF. Sloane had signed it as Sloane Vance, agent in fact for Arthur Vance. Attached to the deed was a copy of the general power of attorney I'd signed myself. The buyer was listed as Azure Development Group, LLC. The sale price, $12,500,000. I felt a surge of professional disgust. Not because she stole from me, but because she was so sloppy. I looked at the notary jurat. The notary was a woman named Mindy Chen. I recognized the name. She was an assistant at the boutique brokerage Sloane frequented. I also noticed the affidavit of authority Sloane had filed. In it, she swore under penalty of perjury that Arthur Vance was the sole owner and member of RV Coastal Holdings, and that he had fully authorized the dissolution of the entity. The fatal flaw. RV Coastal Holdings was a Delaware LLC. According to the operating agreement I had drafted and filed in Dover, the LLC could only be dissolved or its primary asset, the house, sold upon the presentation of a certificate of trustee consent from the Rosewood Irrevocable Land Trust. Sloane had skipped that step. She'd treated the LLC like a personal bank account rather than a distinct legal entity. She had lied to the title company, claiming the trust didn't exist or had been bypassed. I checked the title insurance record. It was issued by a mid-sized firm that clearly hadn't done a deep title search. They'd relied on Sloane's affidavit. They'd seen the power of attorney and assumed it gave her God mode over every asset I touched. They were wrong. A POA gives you the right to stand in my shoes, but it doesn't give you the right to change the size of the shoes. If I, as Arthur Vance, couldn't sell the house without the trust's permission, then Sloane, as my agent, couldn't do it either. I took screenshots of everything. I found the list pendants template in my mental files and began drafting a notice of fraudulent conveyance in the notes app of the burner phone. Then I saw the final insult. Sloane had taken out a short-term bridge loan against the earnest money deposit. She was already drawing against the sale before the ink was even dry on the final closing. She was bleeding the estate dry while I was still learning how to walk again. "You didn't just sell a house, Sloane," I whispered, the light of the phone reflecting in my eyes. "You sold a fantasy, and I'm about to pull the curtain back." The audit was clear. The title was clouded. The sale was voidable, and the developer was currently trespassing on land they didn't legally own. Now I just needed to see where she'd hidden the rest of Rose's life. The digital trail had confirmed the theft of the real estate, but as I dug deeper into the family account Sloane had mentioned, a new horror surfaced. Sloane hadn't just targeted the land, she had gone after the liquidity of memory. Rose had a jewelry collection that was more than just gold and stones. It was a curated history of our travels, a sapphire from our anniversary in Sloane, a vintage Cartier brooch passed down from her grandmother, and a set of rare pink diamonds she'd intended for our granddaughter, Maya. The collection was appraised at over $1.5 million and was held in a separate personal property trust. Using the burner phone to access Rose's private insurance portal, the password for which was the date of our first date, I saw a policy cancellation notice. Sloane had stopped paying the premiums. Even worse, she had filed an asset relocation form with the insurance company, claiming the jewelry had been moved to a private residential vault. I knew exactly what that meant. It was in a safe in Sloane's dressing room, or worse, already in the hands of a high-end fence. But the most galling discovery was Maya's educational trust. Maya is 18, a brilliant girl who had just been accepted into a prestigious architecture program. Her tuition was supposed to be paid out of a high-yield sub-account within the Rosewood Trust. I saw a series of management fee withdrawals, $50,000 chunks, being drained by Sloane's personal LLC. Sloane was starving Maya. She was intentionally withholding the tuition payments, telling Maya that Grandpa's medical bills have exhausted the liquid funds. She was making my granddaughter beg for her own inheritance, while Sloane used that same money to fund the lifestyle upgrade I saw on her Instagram, a new Porsche Taycan and a summer lease in the Hamptons. Maya was the secondary victim of the paper fortress being breached. Sloane wasn't just stealing wood and stone, she was stealing the future I had promised my family. She was using my coma as a shield to commit financial elder abuse and breach of trust. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. In my professional life, I've seen many thieves, but the ones who steal from children and the incapacitated have a special place in the legal inferno. Sloane thought I was the only one who could stop her, and she thought I was a vegetable. She didn't realize that by targeting Maya, she had given me the one thing a stroke victim usually lacks: adrenaline. I messaged Kevin on the encrypted app we'd set up.
Kevin, I need a mobile notary I can trust, someone who doesn't work for the big firms, and I need a messenger to deliver a letter to a law firm downtown, Sterling and Associates. Ask for Old Man Sterling himself. Sloane was moving Rose's jewelry and Maya's future. She was trying to consolidate her gains before I passed away. She was in a hurry, and in the world of title and trust, hurry is the mother of inadmissible evidence. I was going to give her a reason to hurry even faster. I was going to lead her right into a secret safety deposit box that contained her own ruin.
The physical recovery was grueling, but the legal recovery was already in motion. By the third week, I was walking with a cane, and my speech had returned to its rhythmic, baritone authority. Sloane noticed the improvement and, fearing her window was closing, increased the frequency of her check-ins. I decided it was time to play the role of the confused, compliant retiree. When Sloane arrived on Friday afternoon, I was sitting by the window, staring blankly at the park. I had a stack of blank papers on my lap. "Arthur, you look better," she said, her voice laced with suspicion. "I'm tired, Sloane," I whispered, my eyes drifting. "You were right. The house, it was too much. But I'm worried about Rose's blue box. I never told you about the safety deposit box in the old trust building downtown. It has the original deeds, the physical ones with the gold seals." I saw her pupils dilate. To a title thief, a physical deed with a gold seal is like a holy relic. It's the ultimate proof of authority that can bypass digital red tape. "A safety deposit box?" she asked, her voice breathless. "Where is the key, Arthur?" "I don't have the key," I lied, looking her in the eye with a practiced vacancy. "But the bank will open it if I sign an affidavit of lost instrument and a certificate of correction for the Rosewood sale. I realize now I might have left the trust's consent form in there. If the developer finds out that's missing, they'll take the money back, won't they?" Panic flared in her eyes. She'd already spent $3 million of that earnest money. If the deal was clawed back, she'd be facing more than just a lawsuit. She'd be facing a bankruptcy she couldn't outrun. "I'll bring the papers, Arthur," she said, standing up. "I'll have the notary here tomorrow. We'll just fix the record together." The next morning, Sloane arrived with her pocket notary, Mindy. She presented me with a thick stack of documents. She thought she was having me sign away the last of my legal standing. What she didn't know was that I had already met with my old partner, Old Man Sterling, an hour before she arrived. He was currently sitting in the lobby, dressed as a facility janitor, recording the entire encounter. I looked at the documents. They were affidavits of correction. By signing them, Sloane was asking me to testify that I had authorized the bypass of the Rosewood Trust and that all previous filings were made with my full knowledge and consent. "Sign here, Arthur," Sloane urged, pointing to the line. I didn't sign. I looked at Mindy, the notary. "Mindy, you're an officer of the court, correct? You are swearing that I am of sound mind and that I am signing this of my own free will." "Yes, Mr. Vance," she said, looking nervous. "Good." I turned to Sloane. "And you, Sloane, are swearing that you acted as my agent in good faith and that you have not diverted any funds from the Rosewood Trust to your personal accounts." "Arthur, just sign the paper," Sloane snapped, her patience fraying. "Of course I haven't." "Excellent. I signed the paper, but I didn't sign my name. I signed under duress, VC 403. It's an old legal shorthand for "this document is a fraud." More importantly, I had Mindy notarize a second document, one I slipped under the stack. It was a revocation of all power of attorney and a demand for accounting. Sloane snatched the papers away, thinking she'd won. She thought she had the correction she needed to satisfy the developer's title insurance. In reality, she had just walked into a deposition in disguise.
She had testified in front of a notary and a hidden witness to a series of lies that contradicted the bank records I already had in my pocket. The invisible trap had snapped shut. She had the signatures, but I had the indictment.
The day of the groundbreaking ceremony arrived. Sloane had coordinated with Azure Development Group to have the local press present. She wanted the photo op, the glamorous socialite turning the first shovel of dirt on what would become the Rosewood Heights luxury condos. I arrived 10 minutes after the ceremony began. I wasn't in a wheelchair and I wasn't wearing a hospital gown. I was in a bespoke charcoal suit, carrying a leather attaché case and walking with a silver-headed cane that felt more like a scepter than a crutch. Beside me was Old Man Sterling and 2 uniformed deputies from the County Sheriff's Civil Division. The bulldozers were idling at the edge of Rose's perennial garden, their diesel engines a low, guttural growl that sounded like a threat to the soul of the house. Sloane was center stage, holding a gold-plated shovel, smiling for the cameras. "Stop the machinery," I said. My voice wasn't raspy anymore. It was the voice that had commanded high courts for 40 years. It carried across the lawn, cutting through the engine noise. The crowd turned. Sloane's face didn't just go pale, it went translucent. The gold shovel slipped from her hands and clattered onto the gravel. "Arthur," she stammered, stepping off the podium, "what are you doing here? You should be in bed. You're having an episode." "The only episode occurring here, Sloane, is the conclusion of your criminal career," I said. The CEO of Azure Development, a man named Marcus Thorne, stepped forward. "Mr. Vance, we were told you were incapacitated. We have the signed deeds. We've already cleared the title." "You haven't cleared a thing, Mr. Thorne," I said, opening the attaché case. "You were presented with a wild deed, a document signed by someone with no legal authority to convey the property of RV Coastal Holdings, LLC. I handed him a folder. "This is a lis pendens, filed 2 hours ago, and this," I pulled out a heavy vellum document with a deep red wax seal, "is the Rosewood Irrevocable Land Trust original indenture. It contains a restricted alienation clause. No power of attorney, general or otherwise, can authorize the sale of this land without the physical, notarized certificate of trustee consent. I am the trustee, and I never signed." "But she brought us the affidavit of correction just yesterday," Thorne shouted, looking at Sloane. "You signed it, Arthur. We saw the notary stamp." "The affidavit I signed under duress while being held in a facility against my will?" I asked. "The one where I signed VC403 next to my name? That's the code for voidable contract, Mr. Thorne. It's a flag for the recorder's office. It doesn't correct the title, it confirms the fraud." Sloane tried to bolt toward her car, but the deputies moved with practiced ease, intercepting her before she could reach the driveway. "Sloane Vance, you are being served with an emergency injunction and a warrant for grand theft, title fraud, and financial elder abuse." I walked past the stunned reporters and stood on the porch of the house Rose and I had built. I looked at the bulldozer drivers. "Turn them off," I commanded. "The only thing being broken today is a fraudulent contract." Thorne looked at Sloane, then at me. "She's already spent $3 million of the earnest money, Vance. If this sale is void, we're coming for every cent." "I know, and I've already filed the writ of attachment on her personal accounts, her LLC, and that Porsche she bought last week. You'll be standing in a very long line of creditors, Mr. Thorne. I suggest you get a good lawyer. I hear Sterling and Associates are free." As they led Sloane away in handcuffs, she screamed at me, her voice shrill and ugly, stripped of all its socialite polish. "You were supposed to die. You were a vegetable. It was just a house, you old man." I didn't look at her. I looked at the great oak. "It was never just a house, Sloane. It was a promise." The grand reckoning was over. The bulldozers retreated. The silence that followed was the sweetest thing I had ever heard. The salt air is the best medicine I've ever tasted. I'm sitting on the wraparound porch of rosewood, the shadow of the great oak stretching across a lawn that will never see a luxury condo. The silence here isn't the heavy, medicated quiet of the rehab center. It's the peaceful hum of a legacy that stood its ground. The legal fallout for Sloane was as absolute as a final judgment. The paper fortress didn't just protect the house, it collapsed on top of her. Because she used a power of attorney to commit a crime, the corporate veil of her personal LLC was pierced almost instantly. The developer, eager to recoup their $3 million earnest money, stripped her of every asset she had, the Porsche, the Hamptons lease, and even the designer wardrobe she'd used as armor. Sloane is currently awaiting trial on multiple felony counts. The private residential vault she'd moved Rose's jewelry to was raided by the sheriff's department. Every piece was recovered, including the pink diamonds for Maya. Maya's tuition was fully restored with interest, and she started her architecture program this week. I think she's already a natural. I reached for my leather-bound journal and opened it to the final page of the Rosewood file. Final log entry. Rosewood Land Trust Audit, May 2026. Status: title quietened, possession reverted. Observation: greed is a fast runner, but the law has a long memory. A general power is no match for a specific, irrevocable intent. The chain of title is unbroken. Sloane thought a coma was a vacancy. She thought age was a weakness and that a stroke had cleared the board. She forgot that a title attorney doesn't just work with paper, he works with time. I spent 40 years building defenses that didn't require me to be awake to function. I looked at the silver-headed cane resting against the railing. I don't need it as much these days. The strength is coming back to my legs, just as the life is coming back to the gardens. In the world of trusts and estates, people always try to find the shortcut to the inheritance. They think they can delete a life's work with a signature and a lie. But they forget the most basic rule of the land. You cannot build a future on a stolen foundation. I closed the journal. The sun is setting over the water, and for the first time in months, I don't have to check the locks. The fortress is secure. Thank you for witnessing the final reversion of this payback log. If you've ever felt like someone was trying to rewrite your history while you weren't looking, this one was for you. Always remember, keep your deeds physical, your trusts irrevocable, and your eyes on the fine print. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Payback Logs. We protect the legacies that others try to liquidate. This has been Payback Logs. The file is closed. Goodbye for now.